He refused to sell an old Riverside boarding house everyone called worthless, rotting beams, leaky roof, and memories washed thin by time. Henry Caldwell, a 60-year-old veteran turned small-town realtor, thought he was just keeping a promise to his late uncle. But when his loyal German shepherd, Buddy, started scratching beneath the floorboards, what they uncovered, an old flood escape map, a forgotten legacy of courage, would change everything. When the storm hit, it wasn't walls or roofs that needed saving. It was hearts. It was hope. And through the roaring dark, one man and his dog became the light that would not fade. Before we begin, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and tell us where you're watching from. The wind swept through the valley of Maple Run, carrying the smell of wet cedar and cold river stones, the kind of autumn air that tasted like endings. Henry Caldwell drove slowly along the cracked road that curved toward the old boarding house by the Hallow Creek. The sun, already leaning behind the Allegheny Hills, burned through the trees in threads of amber light. Beside him, Buddy, a 6-year-old German shepherd with a thick black and tan coat and one torn ear, rested his head on the window frame, nose twitching at the scent of damp leaves. Buddy was the kind of dog who moved with a soldier's precision, yet somehow managed to appear amused by the world. He had served beside Henry once, trained for search and rescue before the fires in Montana. Now he was just a partner in quieter missions, helping his owner breathe again. Henry, 60 years old, tall and lean, his shoulders slightly stooped from years of carrying too much weight, glanced at the weathered mailbox leaning like an exhausted guard. The letters on it, Caldwell Boarding House, were barely legible under the rust. His face, roughened by wind and regret, tightened as he parked. A thin stubble shadowed his jaw, silver mingling with brown, like smoke refusing to vanish. He had been a man who once ran toward fire when others fled, but the years since that last inferno had turned his running into walking, his shouting into silence. The accident that claimed 2 of his men had been deemed unavoidable. The word had never soothed him. The house stood on a small rise above the creek, its paint peeled down to gray boards, its roof sagging under the memory of too many storms. Shingles littered the yard like fallen feathers. The front porch leaned slightly, as though bowing to time's authority. Henry switched off the truck engine and sat in the stillness. He could almost hear the ghosts of his uncle's laughter echoing faintly. Thomas Caldwell had run this boarding house for decades, taking in mill workers, travelers, even a few drifters. A kind man with restless hands who believed every stranger was a story waiting to be told. When Thomas died, Henry had received a letter. "Don't sell it, boy. Fix it. What you save might end up saving you." Buddy jumped out first, paws landing in a scatter of leaves. He trotted ahead, tail swinging, sniffing the ground near the porch. Henry followed, boots creaking on the step. "Well, pal," he murmured, "looks like home sweet hazard zone." He pressed the door. It groaned open, releasing a gust of dust and pine mold. Inside, the air was heavy with age, old wood, rust, and a faint sweetness of forgotten apples. Sunlight sliced through the blinds, catching on a spider's thread. Henry walked through the narrow hallway. Portraits still hung crookedly, faces of strangers, boarders from another era. In the living room, the fireplace was crumbling, bricks blackened. He crouched beside it, fingers brushing ashes cold for years. "We'll get it breathing again," he whispered. Buddy sniffed the corner, then barked once, sharp and certain, as if agreeing. Upstairs, the boards flexed under Henry's weight. The smell of mildew thickened. He found his uncle's room nearly untouched, a worn flannel shirt hanging on a chair, a pair of reading glasses on the nightstand, and a single-frame photograph. Thomas and a young Henry in front of a fire truck, grinning, smoke-blackened, triumphant. It felt like a message from a life that hadn't finished speaking. When Henry looked out the window, he could see the creek winding below, calm now, reflecting copper light, but beyond it, new survey flags marked the earth in bright orange lines. He knew what they meant. The Maple Run Bypass Project, a road expansion promised to revitalize traffic flow. In truth, it would carve through the floodplain, tightening the creek's natural path. As a former rescue worker, he saw the risk immediately. A narrower channel meant higher velocity water during spring thaw. One bad storm and the whole lower street could drown. He sat on the bed, rubbing his palms together. His mind drifted to the men lost in that wildfire 5 years ago. Mason and Riley, names carved into the inside of his heart. He could still feel the heat, hear the screaming wind. He had made it out only because Buddy had found him under the collapsed beam. Since then, he had traded the uniform for a realtor's blazer, trading lives for listings. But every property, every family he helped move, carried an echo of rescue in it. Maybe that's why he had never been good at closing deals. He always wanted to make sure people were safe, more than satisfied. He went downstairs and checked the breaker box. Dead. The basement door resisted at first. Then, with a shoulder push, it surrendered. Buddy followed, tail stiff, ears pricked. The air grew cooler. A single bulb swung on a frayed wire but gave no light. Henry turned on his flashlight. The beam crossed stacks of boxes, a rusted workbench, and the faint shimmer of water seeping through one wall. "We've got a leak," he muttered. Buddy sniffed, then pawed at something metallic half buried under a tarp. Henry bent down and uncovered an old toolbox, painted with initials TC. When he lifted it, something clinked inside. He smiled faintly. "Guess the old man left us a starter kit." Outside, twilight folded into blue. Henry lit the first lamp in the living room. Its glow softened the ruin into something almost gentle. He sat on the porch steps, Buddy lying at his feet, eyes half closed but alert. Across the creek, the wind stirred the yellow survey flags like impatient fingers. A truck engine echoed in the distance. Headlights swept across the water, stopping briefly at the edge of his property before fading away. Henry frowned. Construction wasn't supposed to start until next year. He rubbed the back of his neck. "That's odd," he murmured. Buddy's ears rose, a low growl rumbling deep in his chest. Henry stared at the darkening trees. The creek whispered below, carrying the reflection of a pale moon and something else. A flicker, brief as a heartbeat, like the glint of metal moving just beneath the water's surface. He stood up slowly, listening. The night answered only with the rustle of leaves and Buddy's soft growl that refused to fade. A cold drizzle swept across Maple Run as November pressed its gray hand upon the town. The river moved slower now, but its murmur carried the same secretive tone Henry Caldwell remembered from his childhood, the whisper of something that never quite left. The morning mist wrapped around the old boarding house like an unfinished thought. Inside, Henry knelt beside the basement door, listening to the low creaks of wood swollen with damp. The air smelled of rust and earth, and Buddy's nails clicked softly on the steps behind him. "You sure about this, boy?" Henry asked, though the dog needed no answer. Buddy, the 6-year-old German shepherd, with his black and tan coat and amber eyes, tilted his head and sniffed the air. His right ear, nicked from an old rescue mission, twitched like a signal. He pawed once at the door, then looked up as if to say, "There's something down there you should see." The basement was colder than he expected. Moisture beaded on the stone walls, and the beam of Henry's flashlight slid over old shelves stacked with jars, broken lanterns, and rusted tools. Buddy sniffed his way toward the far corner, then barked once, a sharp, clean note that echoed against the stone. Henry followed, crouched beside him, and found the edge of a buried object beneath a loose slab of concrete. It took him nearly an hour to pry it open with a crowbar. Beneath the dust lay a tin box, once painted green, now dulled to ash gray. Buddy wagged his tail once and sat as if on guard. "Good boy," Henry murmured, brushing off the grime. He could feel his heartbeat against his ribs, a strange mixture of dread and nostalgia. When he lifted the lid, the air shifted. Inside were 3 things: a leather-bound notebook, a folded hand-drawn map, and a yellowed envelope. The smell of cedar and old smoke clung to the paper. The first page of the notebook bore the neat handwriting of his uncle, Charles Caldwell, a man Henry had admired as a child. Part-time boarding house owner, part-time volunteer firefighter, full-time eccentric, who believed every home had a soul. The first entry dated back to 1987. "The river doesn't forgive shortcuts. When the flood came, the old bridge sang before it died. If I can't save the town, at least I can leave behind its bones." Henry's throat tightened. He turned the next few pages, his uncle's sketches depicting the valley's elevation lines, drainage channels, and the curves of Hallow Creek. Then, tucked between the pages, he found a note scrawled in a trembling hand. "Kiu ngui kung lamot kiu ban nya. Ban ho ve lai mai He stared at it for a long time. The Vietnamese phrase, a relic from his uncle's time working alongside refugee resettlement volunteers in the 70s, roughly meant, saving people is another kind of selling a home, helping them find their way back. The words hit Henry harder than he expected. He leaned back, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Guess you were a poet after all, Uncle Charlie." Buddy gave a soft whine and nudged the map with his nose. The paper crackled open, a crude hand-drawn depiction of Maple Run before the bypass road, with markings in red showing evacuation paths, flood zones, and arrows that matched modern street lines. At the corner, near the river bend where Henry now stood, was a circle labeled High Ground Safe House. Henry realized the spot lay right beneath the boarding house foundation. His heart thudded as the pieces fell into place. His uncle had used this basement as part of a flood rescue route decades ago. The discovery lit something dormant in him. For years he had sold houses, appraised roofs and square footage, always detached, professional, keeping the past at bay. But this was a language he knew. Reading terrain, predicting water flow, calculating how panic moved through a crowd. These were the instincts of a firefighter, not a realtor. Yet maybe, in their own way, both professions aimed for the same thing, to keep people safe. By noon, the drizzle had turned to sleet. Henry climbed upstairs to fetch his drafting tools and laid the map across the dining table. The room smelled faintly of cedar and old dust. He began to overlay modern street grids atop the old drawing, adjusting for the new bypass construction. The deeper he worked, the more the two versions of Maple Run, past and present, seemed to speak to each other. As he drew, his mind drifted to the fire 12 years ago in Nevada, the one that ended his career. He remembered the sound of collapsing timber, the screaming wind, the wall of flame that moved like a living thing. He remembered his partner, Cole Jarrett, disappearing into the smoke to save a trapped hiker, and never coming out. Henry had made peace with it, or so he thought. But now, staring at his uncle's handwriting, that old guilt resurfaced. He had left the rescue world because he couldn't bear another loss. And yet, here he was, drawn back by a map. Buddy broke his reverie by dropping an old glove on his lap, a gesture he often used to demand a break. Yeah, I know," Henry said, ruffling the dog's fur. "You think too much, you start seeing ghosts." That afternoon, he decided to walk to the town library to look up flood records. The sky was bruised gray, and frost glazed the edges of fallen leaves. The Maple Run Library was a squat brick building with ivy creeping up its sides. Inside, the warmth smelled of old books and cinnamon-scented candles. Behind the counter stood Sarah Whitmore, the head librarian. She was in her late 50s, tall and willowy, with silver-streaked auburn hair tied in a low bun. Her skin was fair, lightly freckled from years of gardening, and her eyes, a soft hazel green, carried both intelligence and something weary, like someone who'd watched too many people leave. She wore a moss-green cardigan and a string of wooden beads, the kind made by hand rather than fashion. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, smiling faintly, "you're the one who inherited the old boarding house on Riverside Road, aren't you?" "That's me," Henry replied. "Seems your rumor mill runs faster than the river," she chuckled. "In Maple Run, gossip's a form of community service. What brings you here?" He unfolded a section of the map and placed it on the desk. "Looking for old flood records. This line here, it's not in any modern zoning file. I think it's a drainage path that got buried when they built the bypass." Sarah leaned closer, adjusting her glasses. "You're right. The '93 flood cut straight through this corridor. A few basements were ruined, and the Caldwell house was used as a temporary shelter." Henry blinked. "You remember that?" "I was there," she said softly. "My husband and I helped move the town archives upstairs before the water reached the steps." She hesitated, then added, "He didn't make it through the pneumonia afterward." For a moment, silence filled the room, two people shaped by loss, standing on opposite banks of memory. Henry nodded gently. "I'm sorry. I lost someone too, back in the fires." "Then maybe we're both rebuilding in our own ways," Sarah said, giving a faint smile. When he left the library, dusk had fallen. The lights along the river glowed dimly through the fog. Buddy trotted ahead, sniffing the wind. As they reached the boarding house, something caught Henry's eye, a faint shimmer near the riverbank. It looked like lantern light, swaying once, then vanishing. He frowned. "Probably kids," he muttered, but Buddy growled low, ears pricked. The sound was deep, uncertain, more warning than curiosity. Henry stood for a moment, listening to the silence that followed. The river gave no answer, but somewhere beneath its whisper, he thought he heard something metallic shift, like a gate moving underwater. He turned toward the house, but the porch light flickered twice, then went out. Buddy whined, low and uneasy. Henry exhaled through his nose, setting his jaw. "All right," he said quietly. "Looks like the house isn't done talking yet." By the last week of November, Maple Run had folded itself into winter's arms, frost webbed across the shop windows downtown, and every breath hung in the air like a promise about to break. Henry Caldwell walked Buddy along Main Street, boots crunching on thin ice that had begun to lace over puddles. The German Shepherd trotted close, alert but content, his tail swaying gently. Henry had grown used to the rhythm of small-town life again. Slow mornings, the smell of cedar smoke, and faces that nodded without asking too many questions. But the night's strange glow by the river still tugged at the back of his mind like a thread that refused to loosen. They stopped before a storefront with a wooden sign reading Ruth's Quilt and Craft Haven. Inside, the lights cast a golden warmth over bolts of fabric stacked high like patchwork mountains. The bell above the door chimed softly as Henry entered. The smell of cocoa and cinnamon enveloped him, a scent so homely it made his chest ache. Behind the counter stood Ruth Alden, a woman in her late 50s with chestnut gray hair coiled loosely at her nape. Her build was slender but strong in the way of someone used to lifting bolts of cloth and living through heavy seasons. She had clear, amber-brown eyes framed by faint crow's feet, marks of laughter once abundant and tears long past. Her cardigan was cream-colored, speckled with threads of every hue, and her voice, when she spoke, carried the warmth of wool and the caution of someone who'd had to start over more than once. "Careful with the rug," she said as Buddy sniffed the edge of a braided mat. "Had to mend that twice this month." "Sorry," Henry said, tugging lightly on Buddy's leash. "He's better with maps than manners." Ruth smiled faintly. "A dog who prefers directions? That's a rare breed." "Used to be search and rescue," Henry said, patting Buddy's head. "Still thinks every basement hides a survivor." Her expression softened. "Then he's welcome here. Most of us in this town are still trying to dig someone out." A small group sat at the back of the shop around a long oak table, 3 elderly women stitching quilts, a teenage boy repairing a frayed jacket, and a veteran with one arm missing, humming to himself. Ruth explained that every Thursday evening, her store became a space for anyone who needed to mend something, tangible or not. "People bring what's torn," she said. "Fabric, memories, hearts. The trick is knowing where to stitch and where to let the air in." Henry nodded, looking around the cozy case of color, reds like autumn leaves, blues like river shadows, whites like first snow. The sight stirred something deep in him, an ache for order amid ruin. "That's not too different from selling houses," he said quietly. "Patch the roof, polish the floor, convince someone it's worth loving again." Ruth looked up from a bolt of fabric. "You sell homes?" "Try to," he said. "Inherited the old boarding house by the river. Thought I'd flip it. Turns out it's flipping me instead." That earned a small laugh from her, low and genuine. "You sound like the rest of us. The river always wins, Mr. Caldwell, Henry Caldwell." "Ruth Alden," she said, offering her hand. Her palm was warm and calloused, smelling faintly of lavender oil and coffee. They talked over mugs of cocoa, steam curling between them like a curtain of unspoken thoughts. Henry asked about the town's history. Ruth told him about the flood 30 years ago, when the quilting shop had been a bakery, and her husband, a carpenter, helped rebuild every storefront before cancer took him 5 winters later. She mentioned her son only once, a boy named Matthew who died the previous year in a car accident on the icy bypass road. The way her voice caught when saying his name made Henry lower his eyes. He recognized the particular quiet of grief, the one that moved in circles, never straight lines. Buddy, sensing the shift in mood, nudged her elbow gently. She smiled despite herself, reaching down to scratch his ear. "You've got better timing than most men," she said softly. Henry raised an eyebrow. "He's single, if you're wondering." Her laugh returned, lighter this time. "I'll keep that in mind." For a while they sat in easy silence, listening to the gentle rhythm of needle and thread. The veteran at the far end began humming Amazing Grace, off-key but heartfelt. The sound filled the room with something fragile yet resilient, like light slipping through torn fabric. When Ruth stood to refill their cups, she glanced at Buddy again. "He reminds me of my husband's dog," she said. "Used to wait outside the school bus every day. After Matt's accident, he kept going to that spot for weeks." Henry's voice was low. "Dogs don't let go. They just learn new routines." She nodded, eyes shining. "Maybe that's what we do too. Later, as Henry prepared to leave, Ruth offered him a small loaf of sweet bread wrapped in cloth. "For your trouble," she said. "What trouble?" "Well," she said with a half-smile, pointing at Buddy, who was sitting guiltily beside the counter with a bite-sized piece of bread between his paws. "The theft in progress, for one." Henry crouched beside the dog. "You serious, boy?" Buddy looked up, ears low, eyes full of penitence. Then, almost theatrically, he sat up straight, like a soldier awaiting orders. Ruth laughed, really laughed, for the first time that evening. "He's rehearsing an apology," Henry said. "We're still working on sincerity." Ruth shook her head, still smiling. If only people learned that fast. Outside, snow had begun to fall, fine, deliberate flakes drifting under the amber streetlight. Ruth stepped out to lock the door and watched Henry adjust his scarf. "You planning to stay in town long? Long enough to finish a promise," he said. "That house of yours," she said after a pause, "some folks think it's a curse, too close to the river, but others say it saved lives back then." "Maybe both," Henry replied. "Sometimes the same place can do both." She nodded slowly. "Maybe the same people, too." Their eyes met, not in romance yet, but in recognition. The quiet understanding of two souls learning to live with the aftershocks of love and loss. He tipped his hat. She lifted her hand in farewell. As Henry and Buddy walked back toward Riverside Road, the town lay hushed beneath its thin veil of snow. The glow of Ruth's shop lingered behind him like a hearth in the dark. For the first time in months, the river's murmur didn't sound accusatory. It sounded almost like forgiveness. But as they neared the boarding house, Buddy halted. His ears pricked, nose lifted toward the wind. From somewhere beneath the earth came a faint, rhythmic sound, metal striking stone, measured, deliberate, like someone hammering from below. Henry froze, listening. The noise stopped. Then, in the stillness, a single ripple disturbed the frozen surface of the river. He glanced at Buddy. The dog's amber eyes glowed in the dark, fixed on the water's edge. "Not the wind this time, is it?" Henry whispered. Buddy didn't move. Somewhere behind them, the porch light flickered once, then stayed lit, as if warning them not to look away. Snow had grown heavy over Maple Run, the kind that softened sound and blurred time. The river no longer murmured but breathed slow and deep beneath its crust of ice. Henry Caldwell stood on the porch of the boarding house, coffee steaming in his hands, watching the gray dawn settle over the valley. The hum of a distant engine drew his gaze to the road below, where a black SUV rolled up the hill, its tires crunching the frost like brittle bones. The vehicle stopped before the gate, and a tall man stepped out. He was in his mid-50s, broad-shouldered, with neatly combed black hair silvering at the temples. His coat was a dark wool, pressed and spotless, his leather gloves expensive but uncreased. His face, though striking, carried the stiffness of someone who measured worth in profit margins. His eyes, pale gray, almost colorless, held a cold precision that made Henry's skin prickle even before the man spoke. "Mr. Caldwell," the stranger said, striding forward, his boots crunching the snow. "Trent Hollis. We spoke on the phone last week." Henry frowned. "Can't say I remember that conversation being one I enjoyed." Hollis smiled thinly. "Few enjoy talking about reality. But the truth is, this property sits on a flood hazard zone. With the new bypass construction, it's only a matter of time before the board condemns it." "Condemns?" Henry echoed. "That house stood through 3 floods and a fire. My uncle used it as a shelter during both." "Yes," Hollis said smoothly, "and that's exactly why it's outdated. Sentiment doesn't stop water, Mr. Caldwell. Engineering does." He pulled out a sleek leather folder, flipping through papers. "I represent the Maple Run Development Group. We're planning a riverfront lodge and recreation complex. This area," he gestured toward the valley, "could bring dozens of jobs. A new lifeline for this town." Henry crossed his arms. "And my place just happens to be standing in your way." Hollis gave a practiced chuckle. "You could look at it that way, or you could see it as an opportunity. I'm authorized to make a generous offer." He slid a document across the porch railing. Buddy, sitting beside Henry, gave a low growl, the kind that rumbled from deep in his chest. Hollis's smile faltered briefly. "Quite the watchdog." "Rescue dog," Henry corrected. "He bites only when the situation's not worth saving." For a moment, the two men stared at each other, snow swirling between them like drifting ash. Then Hollis's tone cooled further. "You should think about it. The county's infrastructure team will soon review the floodgate reports. It would be unfortunate if your property were declared unsafe before you had the chance to sell. Henry's jaw tightened. You sound awful sure about something that hasn't happened yet. Let's just say, Hollis said, slipping the folder back into his briefcase, I like to stay ahead of the current. He turned, climbed into his SUV, and drove away, tires spitting slush. Henry watched him go, pulse hammering in his temples. Beneath the snow's calm, something inside him burned. Later that day, at the town diner, talk of Hollis's proposal rippled through the booths like oil over water. Half the townsfolk saw salvation in the promised jobs and repairs. The other half muttered about selling the river's soul. When Henry walked in, conversation faltered. A few nodded politely, others avoided his eyes. At a corner table, Tommy Griggs, a burly mechanic with a beard like steel wool, gestured him over. Heard Hollis paid a visit, Tommy said, his deep voice muffled by the steam of his coffee. Man's been buying half the lower ridge already. I'm not selling, Henry said simply. Tommy sighed. I respect that, but folks are scared. The bypass is clogging up drainage under the old culvert. If we flood again, the whole block will need rebuilding. Hollis is promising to fix that, on his terms. Henry stared out the window at the frozen river. Funny how the same man who causes the problem offers to fix it. You saying he's rigging the works? I'm saying that floodgate's not narrowing itself. When Henry left the diner, Ruth Alden was waiting outside, wrapped in a deep burgundy shawl, her breath fogging the air. You met him, didn't you? She asked quietly. He nodded. Trent Hollis. Man smells like boardrooms and lawsuits. He came by my shop too, she said. Offered to relocate us into one of his new retail plazas. Said the riverfront would be better for tourists than for townsfolk. Henry looked at her, the fatigue in her eyes matching his own. And you? I told him peace isn't for sale, she replied, voice steady but soft. That night, Henry couldn't sleep. The wind moaned through the boarding house rafters, carrying the distant creak of ice shifting on the river. He sat by the old fireplace, staring at the tin box from the cellar, now resting on the mantel. Inside it, the map and his uncle's notes seemed to weigh heavier with meaning. Saving people is another kind of selling a home. He turned on his desk lamp and spread new blueprints across the table. Modern flood maps, bypass schematics he'd managed to pull from the county's online records. The more he studied them, the clearer it became. The new bypass construction had diverted runoff channels, squeezing the flow toward the old culvert by his property. If a thaw came fast, the pressure could burst the retaining wall. Whether by incompetence or design, someone was setting Maple Run up for disaster. By 2 a.m, his eyes burned. He rubbed them, exhaustion gnawing at his resolve. You're chasing ghosts again, he muttered to himself. You couldn't save Cole. You couldn't save those hikers. The old guilt crept back like smoke under a door. The memory of the Nevada fire, of shouts lost to wind, of his own voice begging for silence to find direction. He'd promised himself never to lead again, never to be the one responsible. Buddy stirred near the hearth, sensing the unease. After a moment, the dog patted across the floor, something clamped gently in his jaws. He dropped it onto Henry's boots, a weathered red firefighter's helmet, scuffed and cracked, the emblem half faded but still legible. Caldwell Fire Rescue Unit 14. Henry stared at it. He hadn't seen that helmet since the day he left the service. Somehow Buddy had dug it out of one of the unopened boxes in the attic. The dog sat back, ears forward, gaze steady. Henry felt his throat tighten. That's not fair, he whispered. You don't know what you're asking. Buddy tilted his head, tail still. Then he nudged the helmet forward with his nose, a soft insistence, an order given not in command, but in love. Henry reached out, ran his hand along the scarred ridge of the helmet, and exhaled. All right, he said finally, his voice rough. One more rescue, for the town this time. Outside, the wind rose, carrying faint echoes from the riverbank, the kind that sounded like footsteps in snow, or like something older and deeper stirring beneath the frozen water. By the last week of February, Maple Run began to thaw. The snow along the ridges sagged under the first real warmth of the year, and the river, once silent beneath its frozen skin, started to murmur again, deep and uneasy. Henry Caldwell stood ankle-deep in slush by the edge of the culvert, holding a weather-worn measuring pole. The air smelled of iron and meltwater. The roar beneath the ice had changed its tone, a growl, not a hum. Buddy paced along the bank, nose twitching, tail straight like an arrow. Henry squinted at the numbers on his pole, comparing them to the figures on his clipboard. 8 inches higher than last week, he muttered, and the bypass drains already straining. The new culvert, sleek and metallic, gleamed in the weak sunlight, a project signed off by Trent Hollis's firm. But Henry could see what the paperwork refused to admit. The outflow was too narrow, the river too eager. He traced his uncle's hand-drawn map, its ink faded, but its logic sharp. The old man had understood this land like a living body. Every dip, every current, every vein of runoff that could either nourish or destroy. Henry took a deep breath, the cold air burning his lungs, and murmured, "You were right, Uncle Charlie. It's choking." By noon, clouds had thickened into a bruised gray. He and Buddy trudged back toward town, their boots leaving twin trails in the slush. Inside Ruth's quilt and craft haven, warmth and the smell of cocoa embraced them, as though nothing beyond the door could threaten the world. The store was fuller than usual. Townsfolk packed the tables, a mix of older residents clutching notepads, young families with worried faces, and a few curious teenagers leaning against the walls. Ruth stood at the front beside a folding board, her cheeks flushed with quiet determination. "All right, everyone," she said, her voice steady. "Henry Caldwell's got something important to share. You all know the river's rising again. He's been studying it, same as his uncle did years ago. He's not here to sell you anything, except maybe some peace of mind." Henry stepped forward, wiping melted snow from his jacket. He looked uncomfortable, hat in his hands, but his eyes were clear. "Most of you know, the new bypass construction changed how water moves through the valley. On paper, it looks fine. In reality, it's a bottleneck waiting to burst." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. He pointed to a map spread across the table, half his uncle's drawing, half his own updates. "See this point here? The new culvert. It's meant to handle runoff from both the North Ridge and the old flood channel, but the combined flow's nearly double what it used to be. If we get a fast melt and a heavy rain, it'll back up right under Riverside." A farmer named Ed Jenkins, broad-shouldered with a grizzled beard and rough hands, frowned. "You saying that lodge project's putting us at risk?" "I'm saying," Henry replied carefully, "if we don't reinforce the lower banks or clear the ice jams now, we'll be bailing out basements come March." Ruth handed out folded pamphlets Henry had printed, simple diagrams showing how to clear gutters, stack sandbags, and mark evacuation routes. "We're calling this a safe haven workshop," she said gently. "It's not official, but it's ours." An old woman in a knitted shawl raised her trembling hand. "Mr. Caldwell, are you sure it'll flood?" Henry hesitated, then answered with the honesty of a man who'd seen too much to promise safety. "I can't be sure, but I've learned not to wait for certainty before preparing for danger." The room fell quiet. Then from the front row, a small voice broke the tension. A girl of maybe 8, dark curls spilling from a pink hat, cheeks rosy, looked up and asked, "Is Buddy scared of the water?" Buddy, lying near Henry's boots, lifted his head. He gave a low huff, then tilted it to the side in his usual thoughtful way. Henry smiled. "He's brave, but he knows when to respect it." The girl giggled. "How do you know?" Without prompting, Buddy stood, walked to Henry's side, and gently placed one paw on his boot. The gesture was simple, almost ceremonial, part reassurance, part warning. The room erupted in soft laughter. Even the old woman in the shawl chuckled, murmuring, "Smart dog." Henry ruffled Buddy's ears. He used to be a rescue K9, spent years pulling people out of floods and fires. He knows water's never your enemy, just something you learn to listen to. The meeting continued for over an hour. Henry spoke of slope angles, Ruth spoke of memory, how the '93 flood had taken her husband's bakery, but not her will to rebuild. Together they wove practicality with hope. Henry found himself watching her as she moved among the crowd, placing her hand on trembling shoulders, steadying pens that struggled to write. When one elderly man said, "Guess we're too old to start sandbagging," Ruth squeezed his hand and replied, "Then teach the young ones how. That's the only way to keep what matters afloat." As dusk settled, the storm outside thickened into sleet. The last townspeople trickled out, leaving the shop in a warm hush. Ruth leaned against the counter, exhausted but smiling faintly. "You made sense to them," she said. Henry shrugged. "Sense doesn't always change minds." "No," she said softly, "but it plants something." He looked around at the empty chairs, the smell of cocoa and thread in the air. "You ever wonder," he asked quietly, if we're too small to stop what's coming. Ruth met his gaze. Maybe, but maybe that's why we have to try. The wind picked up, rattling the window panes. Buddy stood, ears pricked, and turned toward the door. Henry followed his gaze and noticed the faint flash of red through the snow, a warning light from the emergency broadcast. Tower on the hill. Moments later, the radio on the counter crackled to life. "This is the Maple County Alert System," said a male voice, strained but steady. "Severe rainfall expected overnight. Flood risk level raised to red for the Hallow Creek and Maple Run basins. Residents in low-lying areas are advised to prepare for immediate evacuation." Ruth's hand flew to her mouth. "Oh, God." Henry exhaled slowly, shoulders straightening. "It's starting sooner than I thought." Buddy barked once, sharp and commanding, as if confirming orders. Ruth looked at him, eyes wide. "What do we do?" Henry reached for his coat, already pulling on his gloves. "We do what we're trained to do," he said. "We listen, we move fast, and we help who we can." As they stepped outside, the sky had turned the color of bruised steel. Rain began to fall, fat drops hissing against the ice as the thawing river roared to life. Henry glanced back at Ruth's shop, its windows glowing like a sanctuary in the dark. And then at Buddy, who stood poised beside him, every muscle alert. "All right, partner," Henry murmured, tightening his scarf. "Looks like the water's coming for us again." And beneath the rising wind, somewhere down by the culvert, came the faint, hollow echo of rushing water breaking through. The flood came like a beast unchained. It tore through Maple Run's narrow valley with a roar that seemed to shake the very ribs of the earth. One moment, there was rain, hard, cold, relentless. And the next, the world dissolved into rushing brown water. The culvert at the north edge of town had failed, choked by timber and metal scraps from the construction site. The bypass, which should have saved them, had turned into a trapdoor. Henry Caldwell's flashlight beam cut through the chaos, slicing across walls of water and airborne debris. The siren from the old mill wailed in long, aching pulses. "Come on, buddy!" he shouted over the wind. The German shepherd, soaked and shivering but determined, bounded through knee-deep water ahead of him, the glint of his canine tag catching stray flashes of lightning. They moved house to house along Riverside Street, following the emergency map Henry had drawn days earlier. Every door banged open to his knock. "Evacuation! Get to higher ground!" he yelled, voice raw from cold and shouting. Families stumbled into the street, clutching bags, pets, photographs, their lives reduced to what they could carry. A young couple, Dean and Marla Owens, appeared next. Dean, a thin man with glasses fogged from rain, still in his mechanic's overalls. Marla, short and freckled, holding their beagle under one arm. Dean's shop had flooded before. He had rebuilt it by hand, which explained the panic in his eyes. "The bridge!" he gasped. "The bridge is gone!" Henry grabbed his arm. "Then cut through Main Street, head uphill to the church. Stay together. Go!" They vanished into the storm. Another lightning flash revealed the twisted silhouettes of the town's power lines snapping like whipcords. Henry pressed on, boots suctioning against the mud. Buddy stopped suddenly, barking toward the east end of the street. Through the sheets of rain, Henry saw movement, a porch light flickering weakly, a shadow waving for help. He squinted, heart sinking. "Trent Hollis," he breathed. The man clung to the frame of his half-collapsed veranda, water swirling up the steps. Trent, the contractor whose shortcuts had sealed the culvert and worsened the flood, now found himself trapped by his own negligence. His normally immaculate hair hung plastered to his forehead, his expensive wool coat ruined, his face streaked with mud and disbelief. "Henry!" he cried out, voice cracking. "Help me! I can't move the beam. It's pinned my leg." Henry stared at him for a moment, rain dripping from his hat brim. A year's worth of tension surged through that single heartbeat. The corruption, the lies, the profit over safety. But then came the second heartbeat, and with it the voice of his uncle echoing from memory. "A rescuer doesn't choose who deserves saving." "Hang on," Henry said. He turned to Buddy. "We'll need the line." He dug through his rescue pack, hands trembling from cold, and pulled out a coil of heavy rope. The current was too fierce for any man to cross safely, but Buddy was trained for it. Years ago, he'd been part of the state's mountain rescue unit, taught to carry lifelines across impossible gaps. Henry tied the rope to his own belt, knotted the other end around Buddy's harness, and crouched to meet his eyes. "Easy, boy. Anchor to the porch post. Go." Buddy whined once, in acknowledgement, and then leapt into the torrent. The current seized him instantly, dragging his body sideways, but his strokes were precise and strong. He fought every surge with instinctive grace, angling toward the half-submerged porch. Lightning strobed, and for an instant Henry saw him vanish beneath the foam. Then, there he was again, clinging to the wooden post with his forelegs, jaws gripping the rope's slack. Henry braced himself and pulled. The line went taut. He secured his end to a stop sign and began inching forward, hand over hand, through chest-deep water. When he reached Trent's porch, the structure groaned ominously under their combined weight. "All right," Henry said between breaths. "We're going to shift that beam together. When I count to 3, push with your good leg." Trent nodded weakly. His usual arrogance was gone, replaced by raw fear. I didn't know it would get this bad," he stammered. "You didn't want to know," Henry replied flatly. "Now, push." They heaved. The beam shifted just enough for Trent to yank his leg free with a cry, but the effort tore at the already splintered supports. The entire porch shuddered, then gave a long, cracking sigh. "Move!" Henry shouted. The deck tilted. In the chaos of falling timber, Buddy barked frantically, sensing the collapse. As Henry lunged backward, a loose rafter swung toward him. Before he could react, a blur of fur and motion struck him from the side. Buddy throwing his full weight against Henry's legs, shoving him clear of the falling beam. The impact sent both of them into the flood. Henry surfaced first, coughing, grasping at the rope. "Buddy!" he yelled. For a terrible moment, there was no answer, just the endless roar of the current. Then a dark shape bobbed up downstream, paddling weakly with one hind leg dragging uselessly behind. Henry kicked toward him, pulled the dog close, and looped his arm under the collar. "I've got you, soldier. You're okay." With Trent clutching the rope and Henry half-dragging Buddy, they made it back toward solid ground, guided by the flickering streetlights and the distant glow of Ruth's shop windows. The flood had receded just enough for them to crawl onto the embankment. Trent collapsed in the mud, gasping, clutching his shin. Henry ignored him for the moment. Buddy lay on his side, shivering violently, one rear leg twisted unnaturally. Henry pressed his coat around the dog, whispering steady words he could barely form. Moments later, a car skidded to a halt nearby. Ruth climbed out, wrapped in her raincoat, hair plastered to her forehead, her face pale but resolute. "Henry!" she called. "We've got the church basement ready. Blankets, generators. Come on!" Then she saw Buddy. "Oh no, sweetheart." She knelt beside them, pulling her own coat off and wrapping it around the trembling shepherd. Henry's voice broke. "He took the hit for me." Ruth's eyes glistened, but her tone stayed calm, steady, like a lullaby. "Then he did what he was born to do, and now we'll do what we must." She stroked Buddy's muzzle gently. "You're coming home, soldier." Trent sat nearby, stunned, mud-streaked, watching the scene unfold. His eyes darted toward the debris still swirling in the current, chunks of the same material his company had dumped near the culvert weeks before. Recognition hit him like a blow. "It's my site debris," he whispered hoarsely. "God help me. It's my fault." Henry turned toward him, exhausted but unsparing. "You can start making it right. Tomorrow, if there's still a tomorrow for this town." The sirens in the distance wailed again. New ones, sharper, coming from rescue trucks cutting through the flooded highway. Blue lights shimmered against the black water. Ruth and Henry lifted Buddy together, careful of his injured leg. The dog's breathing slowed as his head rested against Ruth's shoulder. Despite the storm still raging overhead, there was a strange peace in his amber eyes, a trust that spoke of old battles survived. As they trudged toward the church on the hill, Henry glanced back once. The floodwaters still churned through the street, but the worst had already passed. Somewhere behind them, the river growled but began, at last, to recede. And for the first time that night, Henry dared to believe they might just endure the morning. By the time the lilacs bloomed along Maple Run's main road, the town had changed its rhythm. The air no longer smelled of mud and ruin, but of damp soil and beginning again. Spring sunlight filtered through pale green leaves that trembled as if still remembering the storm. The river, once a swollen monster, now moved with a tired grace, carrying away what remained of winter's violence. Henry Caldwell stood on the repaired embankment, leaning slightly on the rail he had helped rebuild. His hair, once streaked silver, now caught hints of sunlight, like thin threads of fire. A faint smile tugged his mouth, the first unguarded one in months. Buddy lay a few feet away, his thick tan and black coat gleaming in the mild warmth. The injury to his hind leg had healed enough for walking, though he moved with a dignified limp, each step deliberate and proud, as if he carried a medal invisible to all but Henry. The townsfolk had indeed given him one, a small brass badge that now hung from his leather collar, engraved, "For courage and loyalty, Maple Run." When children passed, they often stopped to salute him. Buddy, in turn, would tilt his head solemnly, tail thumping once, a ceremony shared only between the saved and their savior. The weeks following the flood had been relentless. There were council meetings, debris cleanups, endless paperwork. But, beneath the bureaucracy, something remarkable took root. Maple Run, once divided by skepticism and profit, now found a new purpose. The boarding house, Henry's inheritance, and the storm's first target, had survived with its bones intact. Instead of tearing it down, the town decided, unanimously, after much debate, to transform it. That afternoon, the council gathered in the old town hall. The meeting was led by Mayor Celia Grant, a woman in her early 60s, with tightly curled gray hair, dark brown skin that seemed to glow beneath stress, and eyes sharp as carved amber. Celia had been a schoolteacher before taking office, and her voice still carried that unmistakable cadence of calm authority that could silence both children and adults. She adjusted her glasses and looked over the gathered crowd. "Maple Run needs more than houses," she said. "It needs resilience. Mr. Caldwell here reminded us that sometimes the safest walls are the ones we rebuild together." Her gaze softened as she met Henry's. "And so, by unanimous vote, this building will become the Maple Run Home and Resilience Center." Applause rose, a sound both weary and full of pride. Henry didn't stand. He simply nodded, eyes lowering to his weathered hands. He never cared for recognition. He'd learned long ago that praise was lighter than guilt. Across the room, Ruth Alden caught his eye and smiled. Her shop, the quilt and craft store, had become a hub of healing since the flood. Every morning, the scent of fabric dye and cocoa drifted through its open doors. Children stitched patches while veterans recounted, stories that no one else dared to remember. Ruth, 57, her honey-brown hair streaked silver, moved through it all with quiet grace. The sadness she once carried like a stone had softened into something useful, compassion tempered by humor. When the crowd thinned, Ruth joined Henry outside. "You know," she began, hands tucked into her apron pockets, "I was thinking of sewing a new quilt for the center. Every square will bear a name, one for each person pulled from the water that night." Henry's voice was low. "That'll be a big quilt." She smiled gently. "Then it'll keep us all warm." Over the following weeks, the transformation began. Volunteers repainted the boarding house in warm cedar tones. New windows were fitted. The basement, once damp and shadowed, was turned into a shelter stocked with food and medical supplies. Henry led training sessions twice a week, teaching evacuation routes, basic rescue knots, and how to read flood maps. His old skills, once buried under years of real estate contracts, became lessons in survival. The town's children called him Mr. Rope, a nickname that made Ruth laugh until she cried. One morning, as they prepared to hang the new sign for the center, Eddie Rowland, a local carpenter in his early 40s, arrived with his toolbox. He was a big man with a gentle manner, freckles across his sunburned nose, and a missing fingertip, a reminder of a careless day in youth. "Got your sign ready," he said, tapping it proudly. The carved letters gleamed gold. Maple Run Home and Resilience Center. Henry helped him hoist it up, muscles groaning pleasantly. "Beautiful work, Eddie." Eddie shrugged. "After what you did, least I can do is carve a few letters." Then his voice softened. "My sister lives near the river. She told me Buddy barked outside her window until she woke up that night. You saved her." Henry looked down at Buddy, who wagged once, as if modesty was also part of heroism. "He saved us all," Henry said simply. Later that day, as the center opened its doors for the first community gathering, the scent of Ruth's cocoa filled the air. Lanterns hung from the porch beams, glowing amber in the dusk. Children ran between tables stacked with quilts, maps, and jars of wildflowers. The sound of laughter, uneven, still fragile, rose through the evening air like a song rediscovered. Trent Hollis arrived quietly near sunset. He looked different, thinner, humbler, his sharp gray suit replaced by a plain brown jacket and work boots. The lines around his eyes had deepened, but so had their sincerity. He walked with a limp from the injury that night, perhaps symbolic, perhaps deserved. When he reached Henry, he stopped, holding out an envelope. "The county cleared the new drainage project," he said. "We're widening the culvert and rerouting it the right way this time. I'm funding half the cost myself." Henry studied him for a long moment. "You didn't have to." "I did," Trent replied, his tone even. "Turns out profit's lighter than guilt, too." Then he looked at Buddy. "Glad the old boy made it." Buddy responded with a slow blink, the closest thing to forgiveness a dog ever needed to give. When the sun slipped behind the ridge, painting the sky in long orange bands, Henry and Ruth stood side by side on the porch. The river below reflected the light like a seam of silver stitched through dark cloth. Henry's fingers brushed against Ruth's, hesitated, then stayed. "I keep thinking," he murmured, "every time I start to care about something, the water comes back to take it." Ruth looked up at him, her smile faint but unflinching. "Maybe that's the point. We don't run from the water, Henry. We learn how to guide it." Buddy, lying at their feet, lifted his head and rested his muzzle on their joined hands. The porch light flickered softly. Somewhere beyond the trees, the river whispered, not of destruction, but of return. Sometimes, miracles don't come as thunder in the sky. They arrive quietly, in the heartbeat of a loyal dog, in the steady hands of a man who refuses to give up, and in the river that learns to flow again. When the storm passed, the old Riverside house stood not as a ruin, but as a promise. That faith, when held through ridicule and fear, becomes the bridge between despair and grace. If you've ever felt mocked for believing in something good, hold on. God works in ways we cannot see. He sends help through paws and hands, through love and courage, and through people who still dare to rebuild. May the Lord bless every heart listening tonight, those who have lost, those who are rebuilding, and those who still wait for their own miracle. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs a little faith today. Leave a comment about the moment you felt God's quiet presence in your life. And don't forget to subscribe, so together we can keep sharing stories of hope, love, and the miracles that walk among us, sometimes on four paws. God bless you, and may His light guide your path.